Hi everyone, and welcome back to the first session of the afternoon. We are kicking off with a panel around will digital turbocharge clinical development? So to answer that question and many more, I'm sure, in the discussion, I will hand you over to Dan, who is the moderator for the session, who will introduce the panelists. If you have any questions for the panelists, please do put them in the Q&A function on the platform, and I look forward to hearing the answer to that question. Dan, over to you.
Thanks so much, Becky. Thank you very much for joining us in this session. I'm Dan Kendall. I'm the host of the Digital Health Today program and the founder of the Health Podcast Network. With me today, I have three outstanding leaders in clinical development. I will be introducing them momentarily. But first of all, I just wanted to comment that obviously we've seen a huge interest in clinical development over the past 12 months. And we expect that there have been a lot of barriers that have come down, a lot of opportunities have been seized as people are looking to find solutions for the current COVID crisis that is facing everyone around the world. So with me, I have these three great leaders: Laurent Schockmel, who's the CEO of antidotes.me, Charles Fisher, who is the CEO of Unlearn.AI, and Catherine Lee, who is the CEO of Brain Baseline. So thank you, all three of you, for joining us in this session. Laurent, I just want to start with you. We'll go through each of you and just give a little insight into your business and a little bit of the background about why we're speaking about this with you today.
Yeah, sure. So I'm the CEO of Antidote Technologies. We are a patient engagement company, digital patient engagement, meaning that we are recruiting patients for clinical trials. And obviously, especially with COVID, there have been a change in the way that first the patients are perceiving clinical trials, which was, to give you an idea, about 5% of the patients are participating to clinical trials. 80% of clinical trials are delayed or canceled because they are lacking patients to complete their trials. So there is, that's the main pain point of clinical research, is to find patients for those clinical trials. But we can discuss that further, obviously.
Absolutely. Thanks very much. And Catherine, you're with Brain Baseline. So tell me a little bit about what your company does and how you support this area of research.
Sure. So we develop a technical platform that can run an entire clinical trial fully remote. Where we really focus is we have this library of over 50 digital endpoints that can measure anything from gait to tremor to cognitive decline to vocal control using your iOS or Android device. And so the idea is we can bring clinical measurements into the patient's own home. And we hope to, through that, we hope to improve the precision of the types of data that we can collect. We want to improve patient accessibility, because you can't just assume that everyone has the resources to go to a clinic once a week or once a month. And we want to bring more continuity to the data collection. So instead of getting punctuated points, you're able to observe the patient in their own home.
Excellent. Thank you. And Charles, I know you're there in your cabin in Lake Tahoe. You're a San Francisco-based company with Unlearn.AI. You've raised your Series A, and tell me a little bit about what your company does.
Yeah, so, as Laurent mentioned, finding patients for clinical trials is one of the most challenging aspects. And our approach to thinking about that problem is to enable sponsors to run clinical trials with fewer subjects while getting all of the reliability and confidence that they can out of those trials. And we think about leveraging large amounts of existing data sets from historical clinical trials, from real world data, in using machine learning methods trained on those data sets to create computer simulations of patients that we call digital twins, that predict how patients in clinical trials will respond if they're randomized to the control group. And then we can incorporate those digital twins into clinical trials to get robust, confident results while reducing the number of patients between 25 and 50%, depending on the needs of the sponsor.
That's amazing. Yeah, that's a really amazing solution that you've developed. I look forward to diving into that a little bit more. We already, in the first opening comments of this session, we've already talked about recruitment a couple of times. So Laurent, let's go to you. Let's talk about what some of the challenges are. You would think that with clinical trials being such an important aspect of medicine and creating a body of evidence that allows us to have all the therapies that we have available today, you would think that this would be a really robust and well-resourced area where people are lining up at the door to do. You said 5% of patients actually participate. So what are some of the challenges there, and why are there not 95% of patients participating in these sorts of trials?
There are many reasons, and I can touch on a few of them. One, Catherine was mentioning just earlier about the different endpoints, and the complexity of clinical research have tremendously increased. Just to give you an idea, between 5 years of 21 to 25 and 2011 to 2015, this number of endpoints have increased by 86%, which means the level of data, the number of data points, and the complexity of the protocol associated to those clinical trials have increased tremendously. Just to give you another stat is patient recruitment represents 30% of the time that a clinical trial takes. And to develop a new drug, it will take in average 10 years. So the patient recruitment is still one of the major aspects. So how do you find the right patients with the right data points that will enable them to qualify? A lot of patients to be, you need to touch, and we are starting two projects for a COPD, and we are going to touch about 900,000 patients for each of those projects, and we are going to randomize 150. That's to give you the magnitude of the funnel, what we call the funnel, and all the conversions that we are facing through that digital process to get the attention of the patients down to the randomizations.
So over the years of clinical research, has this number been improving? Has it been pretty much steady at 5%, or was it 1% of patients 10 years ago, and now it's increased to 5%? Is there any hope in terms of the increased access to clinical research?
Unfortunately, I mean, that the same problem existed for all those years. Accessing the patient improved, especially through online and digital manners. But on the other hand, this improvement got reduced by the complexity of the protocols. So the benefit you get on the ability to now, 80% of our digital engagement with patients are on the mobile phone, no longer even on. So you can touch many more patients now through those new technologies. But on the other hand, medicine is getting more complex, and therefore the benefit you get on one end, you lose on the other end.
So what is then the solution? I mean, you would think that we would be seeing a lot better access to patients, considering all the data we give away so freely every moment of our lives. You would think that being able to come through that and being able to identify these people that are suitable participants would be a bit easier, a bit more streamlined. So what are some of the things that the technology holds, or that the technology promises, can help to improve this?
Well, one thing, and Charles is there, the representing of that company is doing this kind of synthetic harm. Having the ability to avoid having placebo groups is one of the ways to potentially improve engagement, because a reason why patients will probably drop out of a recruitment process is because they realize that they are going to not to get the real stuff. They are going to get on the placebo group. And because of that, they say, why should I take that risk of being on the wrong side of the trial and not getting the real drug and getting sicker or not getting cured? So being able to have, and I let Charles, because it's his business, to talk about that, will help me in getting more patients, because they will not be necessarily dropping off this funnel that I was talking about, because they will have a better chance to be on the right group of the. Unfortunately, not all the trial can accept a synthetic arm, but I let Charles to talk about that.
Yeah, let's talk about that, Charles. So tell us a little bit more about how this works and when this is going to be suitable. Give us some examples of how this can work in different trials and where it might not be suitable.
Of course. So there are different approaches to incorporating external data into clinical trials, right? So one of those approaches, which people call synthetic controls, takes patients from a real world source and then tries to match them into a trial. So you look at the inclusion exclusion criteria of the trial, try to find patients who are just going, not randomized, but who are just going to the doctor, and you'll stick them in, right? There are other approaches from Bayesian methods that use historical, what people call historical borrowing, or just historical control arms, where you take a control arm that you used before and you just use it again, right? So there's those are all things that have been around now for a while. And by and large, those methods have really been focused on early stage drug development. So looking at phase 2 trials, or looking at specific situations where it's considered either impossible because there just aren't enough patients. So maybe you're looking at a rare genetic disease where 50 people have that disease, and that's all the patients that you could get, right? Or it's unethical to run a control arm in the trial. So those are these kind of specific things. And our approach is really quite different from those methods in that we can develop approaches where you actually still have a randomized trial. Patients just have a lower probability of being assigned to placebo. So you have fewer patients in the placebo arm. And then we can leverage these digital twins, these AI-generated digital twins in these trials of each patient to guarantee statistical properties of that trial. So one of the things that FDA is particularly concerned about when you're talking about large phase 3 clinical trials is ensuring that you don't have false positives. You don't want to approve, if a drug doesn't work, you don't want to approve that drug. And that's a really important, all drugs have side effects, right? So you don't want to take a drug that has side effects that's not effective and end up marketing that to patients. And so the approach that we're taking with digital twins, in contrast to other synthetic controls, we can guarantee control of the type 1 error rate. So we can guarantee that you control false positives. So it's a very different approach that, because it has different statistical properties, is much more widely applicable, not only to phase 2 trials, not only to situations where you want to where you have it being unethical to run a control group, but this is something that could be applied across therapeutic indications, also at phase 3 and for pivotal trials. So the first clinical trial that we've been working on is a trial for a medical device aimed at Alzheimer's, the treatment of Alzheimer's disease. And that's a phase 3 clinical trial that is actually reading out very, very soon. And so we're looking forward to seeing the results of that study. So this is something that I think that when we think about new technologies, and just to piggyback on one of the things that Laurent said, is that there's actually a lot of also complementarity between a lot of these different technologies, right? So if you think about, finding patient, like first of all, reducing the number of patients that you need, but you still always need patients for the treatment arm, right? So you got to find those patients. And then if you could do that in a virtual manner where patients don't have to go to sites, by also incorporating digital endpoints into these studies, you now have a really fully digitally enabled clinical trial that has the potential to be dramatically more efficient than how things are done currently. And so I think that there is an ongoing digital revolution in clinical trials that's really at the intersection of all of these different types of technologies.
And we should probably just talk about the terminology, right? Because I know sometimes these are referred to as virtual clinical trials, but actually the sort of remote clinical trials that you're talking about are not referred to by the FDA as virtual clinical trials. Catherine, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So I guess the way that we see it is there's a spectrum of fully in-person traditional clinical trial all the way to fully remote. So the traditional model, I think we're all familiar with. Then you have this hybrid model where you might still send patients into clinic once a week or once a month, and then you might use a recruiting service or you might use digital twins on the front end, and you might integrate some of the digital endpoints, but ultimately there is still a brick and mortar presence for that trial. And then the fully remote model is kind of where we see the future is now everything, everyone is at their homes downloading an application onto their iOS or Android devices. They're getting measured in the homes, they're self-assessing, and all that data goes back to the drug company. Now, I'm not going to say every single therapeutic area is a good fit for that, right? There are certain things that you simply cannot measure in the home. But if you think about drugs like Parkinson's, if you think about cognition, those are a lot of metrics that actually might be better suited for measuring day-to-day in the home. So we do see those types of trials and those types of therapeutic areas slowly adopt this virtual model.
So with these trials being distributed, like we're distributed now, I think under normal circumstances, we would be together in London on a panel on a stage with a room full of people. We're distributed having this conversation. As you talk about distributing access to clinical trials, there's just a huge amount of data that could be collected. So how do you actually decide what do you collect and what's going to be relevant for the outcomes that you're trying to track?
Yeah, so it's been a major challenge because I think there's no clear consensus on what types of data is important. And I think that, there's a difference between having continuous data collection versus having active data collection in the homes. And our thesis is that active data collection is actually more clinically relevant. So for example, if you continuously track someone's activity level, you don't have any context for, if they're sitting down or if they forgot to take their medication or if it's a rainy day outside, you don't actually know why there's a decrease or increase in activity level without having punctuated active questions as to, oh, how do you feel today, for example. And so we actually believe that active data collection, where you give a patient a time frame for completing a certain task or a certain assessment, is a much better capture of what is clinically relevant data. And one of the ways that we've been trying to validate that in the clinic is we have to actually look at what is being administered currently. So as an example, we're running a trial in Parkinson's where the primary endpoint for Parkinson's is the UPDRS Part 3. That is a paper and pencil clinician administered scale. And the idea is we could potentially estimate what the patient is going to perform on the UPDRS Part 3 by their gait, by their balance, by the tremor, by certain cognitive measures. And so we want to start taking those pieces and those modules that we think are relevant, running them in parallel with what the clinician believes is true once they observe the patient. And you would hope to see, over 90% correlation with the current clinical scale. And so that's kind of how we start figuring out what is clinically relevant and what is currently acceptable by the physicians and by the FDA.
And in terms of getting the patient voice integrated with that data set, how do you go about making sure that you're really engaging the participant and really making sure their voice is raised up? I mean, you can ping them messages all the time. You can have people call them and go and follow scripts, but from a technology perspective, what's the best balance, and how do you make sure that those people, their voices are actually heard?
Sure. So I think part of it, just from developing the platform itself, we've gamified some of the modules so they're more fun for patients to perform. There's certain reward metrics. But at the end of the day, when we think about how do you integrate the patient's voice, what we really think about is what measurements actually matter to patients, right? Because if you measure, let's say, some molecular endpoint, a patient might not ever realize what that molecular endpoint means, right? It might not translate to actually improved quality of life. If I move 2 points on a scale, what does that really mean for the patient, right? But what the patient does know is, oh, I can move around more easily in my house. I am out of breath less when I walk to the store, right? I have a greater radius of movement within my neighborhood, or, I'm tremoring less, or I'm sleeping better. So those are the activities of daily living that I think that patients really care about, and that, that's understandable that they can feel that in their day-to-day versus, oh, I improved, by XYZ metric.
And we see that the importance of patient voice, not only when they are in a trial, but also prior. I mean, in our recruitment phase, we take a great care of, one, making sure, as Catherine said, that what we are going to, the way we express the inclusion-exclusion criteria, which typically, if you look, I don't know if you ever went on clinicaltrial.gov, it's really, if you don't have an MD or a PhD, it's gibberish. I mean, you don't understand what really the clinical trial are meaning. So we take all those inclusion exclusion criteria and transform them in something plain English that the patients can understand. But it's also important to And that's why we have developed this ecosystem of more than 300 partners, 250 patient advocacy groups, because we will go to those patient advocacy groups to say, what is important for the patients? In this particular case, what will make a patient interested in potentially clicking in that ad where we are talking about a clinical trials, so that they relate to it. And if you don't ask the patients or the organizations who are built around patients, you will never be able to get that patient voice. And that's what it's very important to get some, I know it's a buzzword, patient centricity in the pharmaceutical industry, but very few are really being patient-centric. And that's what we are trying to achieve here, by putting the patient in the middle of the process. And you were talking a little bit earlier, how to get more than 5% patients included in clinical trial, because you give them option. So the standard of care cannot necessarily work for them, and that's why they are going to look for other options. But if you tell them they are ineligible without giving them any other option, I mean, why would they participate again? So it's very important not just to screen them for a given project that you have maybe been contracted for, but also if they are not eligible, to give them a way to find other trials, even if you are not going to be paid for it. So that's something we do at Antidote. We direct all the ineligible patients to other resources. We scan 14,000 clinical trials in our match tool. We obviously are going to look for the one that we are contracted for, but if they are not going to be eligible for those, we are going to direct them to other trials, because otherwise you lose those patients. They try once and they won't try again. So it's another way to really put the patient first and patient in the middle of the process. That's a real way, a good way to try to improve that bottleneck that is getting patient into trials.
You've touched on so many points there. I want to double tap on that a little bit and go a little bit deeper. So social determinants of health is one of the things that's being talked more and more about, thank goodness. We've talked about the diversity of the patient population that participates in these, not necessarily in this conversation yet, but just broadly as we've seen the COVID vaccinations and the COVID trials proceed, there's been a real need and real visibility from the media and the researchers involved to really make sure that we're reaching out to diverse communities, to make sure that we're getting people involved. You actually touched on one aspect of this, which is making the trials relatable, making the data, the inclusion exclusion criteria understandable. So how do we, that's one piece, but then you have to find the eyeballs, find the people who are going to click on it and engage in it and submit their data to see if they can actually participate. So how do you be proactive in doing that, not just making it ready, but actually going out and reaching those people. But before I let you answer that, Laurent, I first of all just want to salute you and applaud what you just mentioned there, because that's a really important piece, that you identify these people, and even when you're not getting paid for it, you pass them along and put them in touch with things that they may qualify for. So thank you for doing that. But let's go back to the question: how do you reach out to those populations that may not even be aware that these things exist, or be uncertain about how to even begin engaging?
Yeah, so multiple ways. So one is we have those partners I mentioned, 300 partners, 250 nonprofit. The others are for profit. So, for instance, lab companies, genetic lab companies, pharmacy chains. So they will have in their patient database patients with certain criteria that could match what we are looking for, and they are going to target those patients in a sense on our behalf, and offering them the opportunity to look for a clinical trial, because that's an option that they may not have think about. So obviously not all of them are going to click on that link that they're going to receive from an email or something. Another way to do that, we every time we build, as I said, we work with the patient advocacy group to understand the key messages, the right images. We will always do A/B testing. We will have multiple set of messages, imagery, and my marketing team, digital marketers, are going to test what is working better than others. So some Facebook ads will work better than others, and And we will always, we do multi-channel campaign, and we will look at the channels who are, maybe on this one is going to be Facebook, or maybe it's going to be Twitter or Quora, and based on those different channels, we will focus on the one that perform the best.
That's brilliant. Yeah, I'm glad you're using all those tools that are at your disposal to apply it in this way. Catherine, how about you? What are some of the things you're doing to make sure that not just patient voices are reflected in your research, but also that you're actually able to get a diverse pool of patient voices?
Yeah, so it's been a struggle for the industry, and there's no perfect solution, unfortunately. So what we do is, we hope that the number of patients who are tech familiar and are able to use a smartphone, that pool is broader than the number of patients that can physically commute to a clinical trial site. And so by letting them use their own devices and measure at home, we're hoping that we can appeal and make this measurement accessible to a much broader group of patients. But within that, I think, we're still constantly figuring out ways to, how maybe we can develop this for slightly lower tech devices, right? We're continuously innovating on how can we increase that remote measurement? How can we increase a device accessibility?
Just another stat on what Catherine said. I mean, there was, I think, a Deloitte research studies showed that 70% of potential participants in the US actually live more than 2 hours of the nearest research center. I mean, there is a very large rural population, and for some trials, I mean, those people are more in these rural areas than in cities.
Yeah, and I think even, that's a great point. But even outside of the rural versus urban divide, or even outside of the social economic divide, we're doing trials in rare disease patients, right? Patients who have muscular dystrophies, and older patients who actually find it just physically extremely difficult to get to a trial site, period. And so how can you make life easier for those patients whilst, not sacrificing the quality of the measurements that you get?
Charles, I want to come to you as it relates to diversity and AI. We've heard some conversations about AI building in bias and perhaps overlooking some populations and not necessarily being proactive in making sure that we're teaching AI to look for different trends in different populations. How are you doing this within your company and within this science to make sure that when you're comparing the different data sets, you have a good representative sampling?
Yeah, it's a tremendous problem, right? When we think about, say, if you're looking at data from the United States, any healthcare data that you get will be a biased sample of the patient population, because you are biased towards selecting patients who have better access to care. That's whose data has been collected, right? And so patients who don't have access to care, there will never be data on those patients. And no machine learning based approach is going to be able to learn something important about that patient population. There's nothing you can do except finding ways to reach those patients. Like, it's not a problem that machine learning can fix. It's a problem that you need to get those patients into the healthcare system, right? For us, when we are thinking about sort of broad-based diversity, there are, one of the other aspects is that most real studies that are run, like controlled studies, whether they be controlled, I mean, placebo-controlled interventional, but even just studies that are really carefully designed observational studies, they're small, right? So from a machine learning perspective, we want data on large numbers of people, not data on 100 people, right? Data on 100 people is not what we want. So we have to aggregate data from lots of places. And that means not just data from the United States. I think that that's one of the key factors, right? Especially as we're looking at clinical trials now being run globally. We need to be able to get data from lots of different countries, lots of different patient populations, and aggregate all of those data up to make sure that we can both get a large enough set of patients that you actually have something with enough information to learn from, but also that helps you to get a more diverse look into disease progression, into changing standards of care and other things that you see around the world. And then I'd say the sort of last aspect is that we have to expect that machine learning models will be biased. And then the question is, do you use those machine learning models that are biased in a way that exacerbates existing health disparities, right? So if you take a model that has bias and just ignore that fact and then just deploy it in the world, you're probably going to end up exacerbating some sort of health disparity. So I think it's important that people try to be aware that these models can be biased and then try to deploy them in ways that are robust to those biases so that you're not using them in a way that is exacerbating health disparities. So, for the things that we're doing in clinical trials, whether or not we happen to perform better or worse on certain types of patient populations, that's not going to affect the ultimate decision as to whether or not that drug is going to be safe and effective. Like, it's not going to affect the outcome of the clinical trial. So I think that that's one of the key factors, especially as you start getting into AI-based tools that are more like software as a medical device tools that are being used for actually treating patients, where biases could have a really big impact if you're not aware of them.
I
So
totally sorry.
Go right ahead, Laurent.
I totally agree with Charles on the fact that we can do a lot of things, but there are disparities already between the minorities and the rest of the population. Back to the US, let's say, because that's the country I know best, but it has been exemplified with COVID. I mean, if you look, in terms of hospitalization, severe symptoms and death, the African American communities and Latinos got the biggest hit. And if you look at the clinical trials, basically minority is 39% of the population. I think African American represent 14% and Latinos 18% of the population. We have less than 5% African American in clinical trials and less than 1% of Latinos in clinical trials. There are a lot of reasons. Especially with African American, it is well known that the Tuskegee study, in the 60s, 30s, between 30s and 60s, created a real distrust from that community to clinical research. But still, it's still there. But there are economic aspects as well. When you are working 2 jobs, you are having to take a subway an hour to get home, and then you have to go to an hospital and a site. So that's where virtual trial for those communities could really help and work better to increase that diversity. We, on our end, we are working with partners. Again, we work with the Black Nurse Rock or clinical ambassadors who are really targeting communities of color, for instance. We work with some patient advocacy groups who have really put as one of their top priority to improve diversity in clinical research and are targeting very specific minority populations. So that helps, but we're still far lagging behind in terms of getting non-white, let's say, into clinical trial today.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And in the last 10 minutes or so that we have in our session, I want to take a little bit of a projection forward. This is where we are. Hopefully, we're at nearing the end of the COVID pandemic. Reports say that we're never going to really be rid of COVID. We're going to be living with it differently. We're seeing tremendous uptake for the vaccine in some parts of the world, but we're also seeing some, as you mentioned, Laurent, distrust of the data at this point and reluctance to get that. So as we look ahead, there are some great steps that have been made over the past 12 months for the healthcare industry at large. Even just last month in December, we saw a launch of the Decentralized Trial Research Association, a brand new association that is really focused on increasing access and putting some more science and resource behind it. The roster of the members of that organization right out of the gate has been in the multiple dozens of participants. So real interest there about increasing access for decentralized trials. Part of it has to do with regulations and approvals. And Charles, I want to go to you first because you're dealing with AI. There are various aspects of dealing with AI in healthcare. Part of it stems from just access to data and privacy concerns. And when you look on a global scale, you mentioned global in one of your answers there, there's a variety of ways that data is treated in different parts of the world. So how do you, as a San Francisco-based company, compete, and what opportunities do you see as you look around the world for new solutions that can really have a large impact when it comes into a regulated space like healthcare, and specifically within AI in healthcare?
Well, I mean, there's a lot to touch on there, right? So one of the very, very first things I would say is, just for us, when it comes to patient privacy, it's not just patient privacy. Patient privacy that's an important thing. Obviously, that's something that's often legally required. It's also consent, right? So we actually, all of the data that we are currently using is coming from patients who consented to take part in research studies, not data that was just collected from them while they were going to the doctor and is sold to people without them knowing, right? So we are using consented patient data, and I think that's very important. Lots of people's your data is being sold, right? Your data is being sold, and you don't necessarily have any control over where it's going or who it's being used for. So I think that consented data, and I think that in the future, finding ways to give patients ownership of their individual data and they have the decision about what to do with it, I think that would be great. Now, in the United States, that's going to be hard with just the way our current system is set up, but I think that would be great. You know, when I think about sort of AI and its applications in medicine, I think that we're just really starting to scratch the surface of what's going to be possible, right? If you look at what's happened, you know, just in developments of new technologies for AI, you know, self-driving, I live in San Francisco, we have tons of self-driving cars driving all around the city with no people in them all the time, right? That's something that was not possible just a couple years ago. This past year, DeepMind obliterated the competition on the protein folding problem. I mean, it wasn't even close in this year's CASP competition. And, you know, they've been working on that problem for about 1 year, right? So 1 year of applying an AI-based approach to a really challenging scientific problem produced enormous changes over like 40 years of people applying the traditional approach to protein folding. And I think that we're going to see that type of those types of developments in healthcare, but not necessarily just by applying existing AI technologies, but by people working with clinicians and working with regulators and looking at the kinds of data that are collected and developing new types of AI-based solutions that are designed for this ecosystem. And I think that if you know, AI researchers, if we take that type of collaborative approach, that's what's going to lead to the best sort of well, things that are acceptable to clinicians and acceptable to regulators, but that also have the biggest chance of making an impact in this field.
Right, Catherine, I want to come to you next, and then to Laurent. But in terms of where we are now and where we're going to need to go, the world has changed tremendously thanks to COVID, and it's been an opportunity, and amongst all the terribleness of it, for collaboration and technologies to really be rolled out because of necessity. So now here we are in February of 2021. As we look ahead, you know, what are some of the things that you think we need to do to be proactive, but also some of the barriers that need to be removed in order to remove some of the friction to be more successful?
Yeah, I think, you know, building upon what Charles said about just this regulatory pathway, you know, it's extremely difficult and it's a little bit confusing. And I would say up until, I believe, 2020, there was actually no clear regulatory pathway for how do you even qualify a digital endpoint within a trial. And so you have pharma clients who, you know, frankly, don't know how to even build digital measurements into their protocols. Just as an example, you know, you can build a device that measures gait or that measure, you know, your accelerometer, right? But if that device gets 510K approval, that 510K approval is actually not guaranteed to be accepted as a clinical endpoint by the FDA. And so it becomes kind of confusing. What level of approval do you actually need? And so I think recently, you know, the FDA has released guidance that said, okay, here are the steps to define yourself as a digital endpoint, right? So I think now that we see the door opening up a little bit, and I think that brings relief to a lot of us in the industry. But I think we're also stuck in this interesting circular problem where the FDA expects us to be validated against a currently accepted scale. But if we can all agree that the currently accepted scales are not sufficient, why would we validate a new product against an insufficient current product, right? And so you're stuck in this loop where you almost have to like pace yourself in terms of how fast you innovate, because you always have to come back to what are people comfortable with today? What is clinically accepted standard of care today? And then once people get comfortable around the digital equivalent of that, that's when you can actually start innovating on what else can we do with digital. So I think that, you know, just the conservativeness of the industry, you know, does seem to be hindering innovation a little bit, but we certainly are starting to see a light at the end of the tunnel there. I think looking forward for us, you know, the best partners are the ones who are willing to take that risk. And they don't just see us as a vendor, as, you know, someone who provides a digital product to their clinical trial. We see a partner as someone who is willing to go through that journey with us, right? And, you know, right now we're working with a partner to deploy a COVID trial, and it'll be fully remote in thousands of patients. And if it goes well, it'll be international. And that's something that's never been done before in the industry, at least not on this scale. And these patients will never have to come into the clinic. And so, you know, we want to see partners that are willing to take that kind of a leap with us, because no one really knows how to run a fully remote trial right now. And so we're all learning together. So I think that's where I would like the near future to be, is, you know, for partners in biopharma to, you know, to take a little bit of risk and invest money into small companies like us who are really innovating in this space.
The multinational trial that you just talked about for COVID, is that the one you mentioned before our recording that was BYOD?
Yes, yes.
Bring your own device, yeah?
Yeah, that is completely bring your own device. We released an application and patients are able to just download and record their symptoms. It tracks their cough, and they can actually even order biosamples. So they'll order a kit into their own home, they'll swab, they'll report through our software. And so that's, you know, obviously I think the industry is probably far away from doing that in every single trial, but that's kind of an ideal world, and it's a possibility, right? And it's quite exciting to be able to deploy something of that scale so quickly.
Excellent. Thank you. And Laurent, in the last few minutes, if I could just ask you a similar question in terms of, you know, where we are now, what barriers can come down, and what are some of the, as you peek behind the curtain into the future, what are some of the things that you see coming that's going to help to transform and turbocharge clinical development?
Yes, and I would build on what has been said. I mean, COVID it's an interest. I mean, obviously it is a terrible global plague, but just to give you some numbers, I mean, 67% of less enrolled patients between 2019 to 2020. Ourselves, we 80% of our clinical trial we were working on were put on pause last year in Q2, Q3. So we took a tremendous hit from a revenue standpoint, and the industry really stalled most of the research. And in the meantime, you have patients waiting for these new drugs who are not being able to get them. So there is a terrible impact of COVID beyond just COVID. It's also will have consequences on many other chronic disease, oncology, and other products, because research has taken a pause for 6 to 9 months in some cases. But there is a light out of the tunnel, I would say, because on the other end, it has created an awareness of patients on what a clinical trial is, because everybody was talking about the vaccine clinical trials. Patients realized that to get those new drugs, you needed to have volunteers to participate to clinical trials, and what a clinical trial is. And we have seen that even if we were doing less work, we had our registration increased by 53%, comparing March to December 2020 to March to December 2019. We get more people clicking on the ads, coming to our website to look for options in clinical trials. So the awareness of clinical trials so I hope that is going to last at least for several few years down the road. And look at that. I mean, it took 10, 20 years to develop a vaccine for tuberculosis and some other polio and other worldwide disease in the past. It took 9 months to develop a vaccine for COVID. So I mean, we are not saying that enough, but it has been an enormous work for all the research centers working on those different vaccines. They did an unbelievable work, and nobody would have think that possible. And I think that's what I hope for the future. It really rocked the boat. I mean, the industry got completely shocked, and we are also running a COVID trial. It's 100% virtual. The next one that we are working on will require an injection of monoclonal antibodies in the sites. So not all clinical trial will work really virtually, but at least it has opened the industry to the concept of having these virtual or hybrid models.
Yes. So we're closing out our time together. I really want to thank all of you for coming in and sharing your views and giving us all this additional insight. I'm sure we have a very informed and engaged audience that's participated with this session so far. Just real quickly, if I could ask you to go around and list one or two things that people should contact you about, things that you're looking for, whether it's investment or particular types of partners. Charles, let's start with you. Just real quick.
Absolutely. If you're interested in learning how digital twins can be used to make your clinical trials more efficient, then you can email me. My email is charles@unlearn.ai.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Catherine, how about you? What are a couple things that you're looking for, and how can people reach you?
Sure. We're about to kick off a Series A financing in a couple of months. So we're looking for potential investors. We're always looking for biopharma partners, of course. And then we're also looking for people who'd like to join our leadership team. We're growing really fast. You guys can email me at catherine.lee@brainbaseline.com.
Excellent. Thank you, Catherine. And last word to Laurent. What about you?
We are in the middle of a Series B raise, so any investors welcome. And obviously, if any pharmaceutical companies are interested in innovative solutions for patient recruitment, contact me, Laurent, LAURENT, at antidote.me.
Brilliant. So Charles, Catherine, Laurent, thank you very much for taking the time with the panel. It's been really very informative. It's an exciting time for clinical research and clinical development. So thank you for all of your contributions. Keep up the great work, and I'll hand it back to Becky. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, everyone. That was a really fantastic discussion, and I'm sure everyone got as much of sort of information out of that as I did. So thank you once again. Everyone that's watching, I'm sure you'll agree that was absolutely brilliant, and I hope you're able to join us later on for our next panel, Unlocking the Secrets of the Genomics Revolution. Until then, stay safe, stay healthy, and I will see you soon.